in my soul. It's good to see you out this morning. We're glad that you could be with us. And speaking of people being with us, we want to talk about someone today who is always with us. God is always with us. I will never leave you. In Hebrews chapter 13 and verses 5 and 6, it's interesting the connections that are made here. The writer of the book of Hebrews says, "Let your conduct be without covetousness. Be content with such things as you have, for," or because. So it's interesting. So he's talking about being without covetousness and being content. And then he gives us the reason for our need to be content and without covetousness. "For he himself has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you." So he says the reason that we stay away from covetousness, the reason that we are content with the things that we have, is because God has promised to never leave us or forsake us. You think about putting those two things together. That's what the writer of Hebrews does. And then he goes on in verse 6 to say, "So we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper, I will not fear. What can man do to me?" You see, the thing about it is, man can take away your house, your car, your food, your clothing, your wealth, all your bank accounts, or anything else. Man can take those things away from you. But man cannot take God away from you. As we think about this, how many of us consider ourselves covetous? You ever heard anybody admit to that, confess to being covetous? We hear people say, well, I really struggle with my temper. We hear people admit to being alcoholics, drug addicts. We hear people admit, I lie, or I've stolen things. All of these things that people admit to, but when's the last time you heard somebody say, the sin that I really struggle with the most is being covetous? I can't recall ever hearing anybody confess that one. People will confess all kinds of other things, but not to being, in essence, greedy. Not to being covetous. And yet the fact that we are warned about it so many times in the scriptures tells me it's a sin that a lot of people actually do struggle with. The problem is they just won't admit to struggling with it many times. Have you ever considered yourself to be one who struggles with that? Have you ever heard anybody admit it? I can't think of anyone that's ever admitted it. But I know all of us, when we see somebody else with that fancy new car or that nice new house or maybe that nice new boyfriend or girlfriend or spouse when we were younger, maybe more now than as we get older. But maybe we start to think, wow, I wish I had that. I wish I could have what that person has. And that's the root of covetousness. It's really just another word for jealousy. Jealousy of wanting what somebody else has, what doesn't belong to us. In the Ten Commandments, that's what's warned against. Do not be covetous of your neighbor's house, or your neighbor's wife, or your neighbor's servants, or your neighbor's animals of different kinds, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Don't think I should get to have their things. Maybe more of us have struggled with that at different points in our life than we'd like to admit. Because who among us hasn't at one time or another looked at something that somebody else had and said, I wish I had what they have. There's an entire phrase called keeping up with the Joneses that's about that very concept of whatever my neighbor's got, I got to get as good as they've got or even better so that then they want to try to keep up with me. And that's the idea behind this. And then we have to ask ourselves the question too, in our effort to have more of anything, have we, in the process of trying to get more of something, decreased our time for God? Have we put God on the back burner because this other thing was something we were more interested in or more excited about or more focused on? When we focus on something else before God and put that before Him, that also is covetousness. That's the covetousness that is described as idolatry. Where we've then put the focus of whatever that thing that we're trying to get a hold of, and we put that ahead of God, that becomes a sin of an even different caliber than just being jealous of somebody or being covetous of someone. We've now put that thing as a more important thing than God. So let's look at what he says here. First he says, let your conduct be without covetousness. Our greed, our desire for gain can drive us sometimes to do things that are quite foolish. There's a story in an ancient Persian legend that tells of a man named Al-Hafed who owned a large farm, and it was very prosperous. But one evening a visitor came and told him about these fabulous amounts of diamonds that could be found elsewhere in the world. And so he sold his farm and he went off in search of these diamonds, this great wealth that he could find. He finally, after searching for years, found nothing. He was broke. He was homeless. He was in despair, and he finally committed suicide. He had given up a good life to go in search of a phantom dream because he was greedy for more wealth. But the twist on the story is that the man who bought his farm saw a glint one day as he was plowing the fields. And he got closer and he looked, and to his amazement, he pulled out a large diamond. Poor Al-Hafed had spent his life traveling distant lands seeking jewels, and they were there in his own farmland the whole time. If he had continued plowing his land, he could have been the one who found. And this man found more valuable gems. He left what was precious behind. That's what happens with covetousness. In Luke chapter 12 and verses 15 through 21, Jesus is confronted just before this by someone who's greedy. We know, if we've studied the Old Testament law and the way that it worked, when a father died and left his possessions behind, 2 portions went to the oldest son, and then a single portion to the younger sons. Well, in this case, this apparently younger son was not happy with that. And so he comes to Jesus saying, Jesus, make my brother share the inheritance with me. He wants equal shares. He's not happy with his 1/3. He wants half. He wants his brother to give up the 2/3 and only have half, and he'll get half. And he thought that was fair. Well, Jesus said, who made me a judge or an arbiter over you? But then he said to them, take heed and beware of covetousness, For one's life does not consist of the abundance of his possessions. He turned it back on the very one who had asked and said, here's the real problem here. You want more than you deserve. Now, quite honestly, neither of these boys necessarily deserved anything. The father could have given away all his goods to somebody else before he died if he'd wanted to. We sometimes think we deserve an inheritance. We don't deserve an inheritance. We're fortunate if we get an inheritance, but we don't deserve it. We haven't earned it in some way. But he says to beware of that. And then he told them a parable about a rich man whose field yielded plentifully. And he thought to himself, what'll I do? I don't even have room to store my crops. So he said, this is what I'll do. I'm going to tear down my barns and build bigger ones to put it in. And then I'm going to say, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your soul will be required of you. And then who's going to get all of these things that you've stored up? And he says, so is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. The one who's covetous, the one who's greedy, the one who just wants more and more piled up. Even if he had built those barns and stored all of his corn or grain or whatever he had in there, that much, one of two things is going to happen before he ever gets the chance to eat it. Either some rats or animals or some kind are going to get in there and get to it and eat it, or it's going to rot. You can't just store things up in the barn forever. They don't last forever. We've got to beware of that kind of an attitude. Verse 21 is the very definition of covetousness. The one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. God has to come first. The covetous will not be allowed in heaven. 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 11. It says, do you not know the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor homosexuals, nor sodomites, nor thieves, nor covetous, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor extortioners will inherit the kingdom of God. He makes it very clear. He puts that in there with many other sins. You can't make it to heaven if your heart is set on possessions of this world. Our heart has to be set on heaven. Our heart has to be set on God in order to be there with him for eternity. The second thing we want to notice is that he says, then be content with such things as you have. What would make you content? What's the dollar amount where you would say, that's enough, I don't need any more? What is the size of house, size of wardrobe, size or type of vehicle, or what is it? What is the thing where you say, if that's the level, if I could get that, then I'd be happy. Then that would be enough. Well, there's not really one for most that are not content with what they already have. There's never enough. You can never get so much that you think, I don't want some more, if you haven't learned contentment. The story is told of a wealthy employer one day who overheard one of his workers exclaiming, oh, if only I had $1,000, I would be so happy. I would never need anything else. I would be perfectly content if I just had $1,000. So, wanting to see someone who was perfectly content, he said, let me give him $1,000. And sure enough, he gave the employee the money and left, but just went around the corner and listened. And sure enough, as soon as the employee thought the boss was out of earshot, they turned to their companion and said, "Why didn't I ask for 2,000?" That perfect contentment didn't last very long. And that's the way it is with so many of us. We always think, well, if I had this, I'd be happy. But then we get that, and guess what? We're not happy. We think, well, if I had this, had a little more. We talked about that some in class this morning, that lack of contentment. A woman's born with straight hair, she curls it. She's born with curly hair, she straightens it. If it's winter, we want it to be summer. If it's summer, we want it to be cooler. If it's raining, we want it to dry out. If it's dry, we want rain. Everything we do, everywhere we go, we're constantly discontent. We're constantly wishing it was a different way than the way that it is. And that's a problem. The writer of Hebrews says, be content with such things as you have. Be happy with what you've got. Philippians 4 and verses 10 through 13. Paul had learned this lesson. He hadn't always known it. When he was in Judaism, he was striving to be at the peak. He was going beyond everything that his fellow youngsters were going after. And he was getting higher and higher and he wanted to be the head of the Pharisees one day. But he learned a new lesson. He says, as he's bragging on them about their care for him, he says, not that I speak in regard to need, in verse 11, for I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. I know how to be abased, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I have learned to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. You want to learn contentment? You're going to have to come to Christ. Christ is the one who offers us contentment. Nothing in this world can ever make us content, but Christ can. In 1 Timothy 6, verses 6 through 10, Paul here tells Timothy that godliness with contentment is great gain. A lot of people are trying to find, how can I have a great gain? How can I make a lot? How can I get great wealth? Well, the greatest wealth you can get is to be content with what you have and to be godly. You put those two things together, that is the greatest wealth there is in this world. No one is richer than the person who is godly and content with what they have. Oh, other people might have more money, but no one's more content and more blessed, and no one has a greater gain or greater wealth. And he warns about how dangerous it is to be rich. What temptation there is. The love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. And people have strayed from the faith because of their greediness and been pierced through with many sorrows. We've got to beware of the danger of loving money. And so then he explains the why, of course. For he has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. You remember that poem about the footprints in the sand? And the fellow sees the footprints, and there's two sets, and then during what was his hardest part of life, there's only one. And then he questions the Lord about it. Where did you go when I needed you most? And the Lord reminds him of the truth of the situation. You weren't walking alone there. I was carrying you during that time. You couldn't walk on your own during that time. I was carrying you. And then, of course, there's the updated version where there are the two streaks down through the sand, and the Lord said, and that's where I was dragging you because you didn't want to go. That's kind of a different story. But those footprints in the sand, he's never going to leave us. If we only saw one set of footprints in the sand, it's not because he has abandoned us for sure. In 1 Samuel 12 and verses 20 through 22, Samuel tells the Israelites, "Do not fear. You have done this wickedness, but do not turn aside from following the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart, and do not turn aside, for then you would go after empty things which cannot profit or deliver, for they are nothing. For the Lord will not forsake his people for his great name's sake, because it has pleased the Lord to make you his people." Samuel says, yes, you've sinned. You've done wrong. But he says, you turn back and serve the Lord. He will not abandon his people. He's not going to forsake his people. He'll be with them. In Psalm 37 and verses 25 through 28, the psalmist says that the righteous are never forsaken. At least he's never seen it. He says, I have been young and now I am old, yet I have never seen the righteous forsaken, nor his descendants begging bread. And he talks about why. Because the righteous is merciful and lends, and his descendants are blessed. In other words, he's not covetous, he's not greedy, he shares with those in need. The Lord loves justice and does not forsake his saints, he says in verse 28. So again, the Lord is not going to forsake the righteous. He's not going to forsake his saints. And then we have to remember that Jesus is always with us. In Matthew 28, verses 18 through 20, the thing he promised his disciples, and it continues to be the case today. He said in verse 20, "Lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age." That's why I don't like to fly, because he said, I am with you lo. That's not what it means, of course. But he is with us, even to the end of the age, even to the end of this world. Jesus is with those who follow him, with those who believe in him, those who are his. He's always here. He's here with us this morning. He was with you before you got here. He'll be with you when you leave here. If you're his, you're always in his company. He will never forsake us. He will never leave us. So what's the real message here that the Hebrew writer is getting to us? The real message is that our trust should be in God, because he'll never leave. Not in riches, not in physical possessions, not in things of this world that are going to leave. They're going to be gone. They will not always be with us. In Job chapter 31 and verse 24, Job is defending himself against his friends who are claiming that he's done all sorts of wickedness. And one of the evils that they claimed was that he was so greedy that he's taken advantage of the poor. And Job himself says in verse 24, "If I have made gold my hope, or said to find gold, you are my confidence." And he goes on to describe a few more things in the following verses. And then at verse 28 he says, "This also would be an iniquity deserving of judgment, for I would have denied God above." He says, if I put my hope in gold, if I made gold the thing that gives me confidence, money, wealth, if that's where my confidence lies, then I've denied God. Hope in money is a denial of God, because we are to have our hope in God. A trust in riches rejects God's strength. Psalm 52 and verse 7 says, "Here is the man who did not make God his strength, but trusted in the abundance of his riches and strengthened himself in his wickedness." They say money can't buy happiness. They say money can't buy love. But the most true statement of all is that money can't buy a home in heaven. There is no amount of money on this planet that can buy you a place in God's heavenly home. And the good news for those who don't have riches is it doesn't cost anything to get there. You can get there even if you don't have money. You can't buy it, and you won't be kept out because you don't have any money to buy it. Those who trust in riches will fall, Proverbs 11:28 tells us. He who trusts in his riches will fall, but the righteous will flourish like the foliage. A trust in riches distances us from heaven. In Mark chapter 10 and verses 17 through 27, Jesus says it's difficult for the rich to enter heaven. He doesn't say it's impossible, but he says it's difficult. The more money we have, the more of a tendency we have to rely on that money. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't poor people who are greedy and covetous. There are. They want, like the man who came to Jesus saying, make my brother split the inheritance. There are many poor who want more and more, and they'll never have enough either because it's the mindset. But if we trust in riches, it's a problem. Jesus said how hard it is for those who have riches to enter the kingdom of God. The disciples were astonished, but Jesus said, children, how hard it is for those who trust in riches. See, there's the key. Not having the riches, trusting in the riches. Those who trust in riches to enter the kingdom of God. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. And they were greatly astonished and said among themselves, who then can be saved? But Jesus looked at them and said, with men it is impossible, but not with God, for with God all things are possible. Your money can't get you into heaven, but God can. So whether you've got money or don't have money, you got to get into heaven the same way, with God. The lack of money won't get you into heaven either. It's not like, these people are poor, so God's going to take them to heaven. No. These people are rich, so God's going to take them to heaven. No. God's going to take those who trust in Him, who follow Him. Those are the ones He's going to take to heaven with Him. With God, all things are possible. In 1 Timothy 6:17, Timothy is told to warn them, command them, those who are rich in this present age, not to be haughty or arrogant, nor to trust in their uncertain riches, but in the living God, who gives us richly all things to enjoy. Money comes and goes. Kinds of money come and go. Entire countries' currencies come and go. They don't even exist anymore. Many of the different currencies throughout the history of the world, they're worthless now. They're useless. But God never fails. His value has not changed one iota since the beginning of time. He has been, is, and always will be the most valuable thing that we can put our trust and hope in. William Barclay said that money in itself is neither good nor bad. It's simply dangerous in that the love of it may be bad. With money, a man can do much good, and with money, he can do much evil. With money, a man can selfishly serve his own desires, and with money, he can generously answer the cry of his neighbor. With money, a man can buy his way to the forbidden things and facilitate the path of wrongdoing. And with money, he can make it easier for someone else to live as God meant him to live. Money brings power, and power is always a double-edged thing. For it is powerful to do good or powerful to do evil. The real measure of our worth is how much we'd be worth if we lost all our money. If we lost all our possessions, if it was just us and the shirt on our back, then what would we be worth? That's our real value. As a child of God who has nothing is more valuable than all the money in the world. Jesus said, what would a man give in exchange for his soul? If he gained the whole world and lost his soul, what good would it be? That soul is more valuable than anything else. If you lost all your money and all your material goods, all your possessions, would your faith and trust in God remain? Or do you only trust Him because you think He's blessed you with those things, and if you lost those things, you wouldn't trust Him anymore? Where is your trust? Is it possible this morning that you have left the acres of diamonds, God and His kingdom, in your search for the phantom worldly riches that pass away? In Proverbs, the Bible tells us that riches, money, makes itself wings and flies away. And it certainly can. But let's hang on to the true treasure. Matthew 13:44 through 46. Jesus said, the kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it and hid it, and for joy over it, he goes and sells all that he has to buy that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant seeking beautiful pearls. When he finds the one pearl of great price, he went and sold all that he had and bought it. The kingdom of heaven is that pearl of great price. The kingdom of heaven is that true treasure. Jesus is that treasure, and we need to purchase it. If we have to give up everything to buy that, it's well worth it. If you're here and you find yourself struggling or tempted by the physical things of this life, the financial, material, status symbol things that this world offers, and you find yourself tempted to follow those things instead of God, maybe you need prayers of the church. Maybe you've put those things above God. Maybe you've never even given your life over to Him because you want the things that you possess to be yours and not consider them His. Give your life over to Him. Everything that you have is His already anyway. If you're here and you have a need to respond to God's invitation for any reason, please do so as we stand and as we sing. It is for you.